The following words were written by Sabonfu Some and have become a theme for our group of organizers that have collaborated to host the Juneteenth celebration over the last 2 years. It goes as follows. Community is an environment where you can find a home in each other's heart and soul. It is a living entity with spirit as its anchor, where a group of people are empowered by one another, by spirit and by the ancestors to be themselves, carry out their purpose, and to use their power responsibly. If we're being completely transparent, I am very proud of our efforts in establishing the celebration of our ancestors and the freedom from American chattel slavery. I'm also not afraid to admit that at times, our efforts have fallen short in terms of instilling in those who came before us an accurate, precise version of the history of Juneteenth and its importance for the next generation of African Americans to follow. And when this was brought to our attention, a few people stepped forward to correct us and to volunteer the knowledge in order to help us do just what some suggested as the spirit of community. Empowered by our elders, we can absorb the knowledge, carry out our purpose, and use our power responsibly. So it is under the spirit of community and our responsibility to it that we introduce a very special guest speaker this evening, who can better narrate the history of the holiday that we will be celebrating in less than 2 weeks on Saturday, June 16th in Isaac Murphy Memorial Art Garden. So to introduce this beautiful soul in front of us is Marilyn Dishman. She is a published poet, a freelance writer, a retired speech, English, and communications teacher who has written, directed, and produced Black Heritage Juneteenth programs and international festivals. While living in Austin, Texas, she participated in every Juneteenth celebration while teaching intergroup relations and cultural awareness at Gary Job Corps Center. She researched and wrote lessons plans for the students and teachers to learn about the numerous ethnicities and races. She developed a 2-day festival called the International Day of the Child, which included a lesson plan to define the ethnicity information about the religion, custom, diet, music, clothing, and geography to minimize racial and cultural conflicts. So without further delay, it is my pleasure to welcome Ms. Marilyn Dishman.
Thank you so much. And I feel the same way that some of you do now. When I first moved to Texas, and we moved down there in August, so we missed the first one. And the next year, everybody kept talking about Juneteenth, and it's like, what is Juneteenth? Because coming from Kentucky, I'd never heard of it before either. Sadly to say, a lot of the people I asked down there really didn't know the true meaning. So that's why I had to do a lot of researching and reading to find out why was this holiday even a holiday, you know? And it was very interesting, and even though the director of education was from Kentucky, she had become accustomed to the southern lifestyle of Texas. And when I wrote the Juneteenth lesson plan, there were so many redacted parts in there where she felt like, don't mention these. It could start a race riot. Which is sad, you know, because a lot of the stuff that she removed was true. Now, it's not to say that all of it was, because some of it's rumors or myths, which I'll tell you about here. But I think it's a wonderful thing that they at least have a day to celebrate their emancipation, because the 4th of July was really not our Independence Day, as you know, because we weren't independent. Anyway, Juneteenth, which is also known as Juneteenth Independence Day or Freedom Day, is an African-American holiday that commemorates the June 19, 1865 announcement of the abolition of slavery in Texas and the emancipation of enslaved African-Americans throughout the former Confederacy of the Southern United States. Its name is a combination of June and 19, which is the date of its origin. Juneteenth is recognized as a state holiday or special day of observance in 45 states, not Kentucky. There's a push to make it nationwide, and that would be nice if we all could do that. Today it's observed primarily in local celebrations. Traditions include reading of the Emancipation Proclamation, singing Negro spirituals, such as Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, and Lift Every Voice and Sing, you know it's a given. And reading of works by noted African-American writers such as Ralph Ellison and Maya Angelou. Celebrations include rodeos. We don't have them up here, but they're big down here. And they have black rodeos as well. I didn't know they existed until then. Park parties, historical reenactments, or Miss Juneteenth contest. The Mestiços, descendants of black Seminoles of Chihuahua, Mexico, also celebrate Juneteenth. And forgive me if I'm mispronouncing the Spanish because I don't know Spanish, okay? The Mestiços, also known as Negros Mestiços, are an African group in Chihuahua, Mexico. The group are descendants of the black Seminoles escaping from the threat of slavery. I know some of you probably are not aware that there are, I wouldn't say pure Africans still in Mexico, but there are some. I think they're called mesquites. The African diaspora is all over the world. It's pervasive. But most of us just don't know the connections. And when you do your genealogy, you might discover it's closer than you think. Okay. During the Civil War, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on September the 22nd, 1862, to become effective January 1st, 1863. It declared that all enslaved persons in the Confederate States in rebellion, but not in Union hands, would be free. However, this excluded Kentucky and the 4 other states later known as border states, which were the slave states but not in rebellion. Maryland, Delaware, Missouri, and those counties of Virginia soon to form the state of West Virginia, and 3 zones under the Union occupation: the state of Tennessee, there's one person from there, Lower Louisiana, and Southeast Virginia. For reasons that are still debated, all of Texas, Southern Oklahoma, Southwest Arkansas, and Western Louisiana did not free their slaves when they were told to. One of the reasons given for the delay in those slaves not being freed until June 19, 1865, was that General Gordon Granger was sent to Galveston, Texas on a mule. Being in Kentucky, we know that mules are not quite as fast as our thoroughbred racehorses. There was one rumor that the mule died upon arrival. Even if it did, couldn't he have gotten another one? Okay. Another explanation is that General Granger's listened to Kentucky Southern empathizers who asked the general to delay the message until after their crops were harvested. But that was 2 years. Okay. When the war ended, Granger was given command of the District of Texas. On June 19, 1865, in the city of Galveston, one of the first orders of business was to read to the people of Texas Granger's General Order Number 3, which began with, "The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection therefore existing between them becomes that of an employer and free laborer." But I think they took free the wrong way. This set off joyous demonstrations of freedmen and originating the annual Juneteenth celebration, which commemorates the abolition of slavery in Texas. You might recall through elementary school in your social studies class when Abraham Lincoln read his Emancipation Proclamation. In the condensed version, many learned that this executive order meant immediate freedom for slaves throughout the nation. However, since the country was still in the midst of a civil war, those states that had seceded from the Union did not adhere to the proclamation, and slaves in those states remained unfree. Though much of the language in the Emancipation Proclamation suggests otherwise, Lincoln's primary objective was not to ameliorate the lives of those in bondage. Instead, his intent was to preserve the Union. I know a lot of people think that he was just so empathetic with the slaves that he wanted to free them, even though he didn't own slaves himself. That's a myth a lot of people were told and believe. Lincoln never owned slaves himself, but he wasn't quite as sympathetic or empathetic enough to let our ancestors free. Though much of the language, Lincoln's primary, in August 1862, Horace Greeley, the editor of the New York Tribune, published an editorial addressed to Lincoln pressuring his stance on slavery and urging him to abolish it. Lincoln responded in an open letter to Greeley published in the Tribune that same August. My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union. It is not either to save or destroy slavery, Lincoln wrote. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save the Union. That makes it pretty clear. Lincoln and the Union Army used slavery as a political motive to justify strengthening military endeavors against the Confederacy. Black soldiers were able to fight for the Union when Lincoln passed the proclamation. Though they faced discrimination and often performed menial roles because of presumed incompetence, they increased the Union Army in size. Throughout the war, Texas was not monitored as closely as other battle states, and that's part of the reason Texas still listens to the beat of its own drum and doesn't necessarily move with the rest of the nation. For this reason, many slave owners moved to Texas with their slaves. With its relatively negligible Union presence, slavery continued there for much longer. After the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect, slaves in war-torn states often escaped behind Union lines or fought on its behalf. The slaves who got the news were jubilant to hear of the freedom of Juneteenth. In the book Lone Star Past, Memories and History of Texas, Felix Haywood, a former slave, who gave a testimony about Juneteenth as a part of the New Deal project. The end of war, it's come just like that, like you snap your fingers. Hallelujah broke out. Soldiers all of a sudden were everywhere, coming in bunches, crossing, walking, and riding. Everyone was a singing. We was all walking on golden clouds. Everybody went wild. We was free. Just like that, we was free. Freedom did not come at the snap of a finger for everyone in Texas. Some people who should have been free continued to work through the harvest season because their masters withheld the announcement to reap more wages out of their slaves. This left many former slaves treated as though they were still in bondage. In Lone Star Past, Susan Merrick reported, lots of Negroes were killed after freedom, bushwhacked, shot down while they were trying to get away. You could see lots of Negroes hanging from trees, which we call lynchings, in Sabine, bottom right, after their freedom. They tried every way to run. In the 1870s, a group of former slaves pooled together $800 through local churches to purchase 10 acres of land and create the Emancipation Park to host future Juneteenth celebrations in modern-day Houston. If you ever have a chance to go to Houston, I would strongly encourage you to go to Emancipation Park, especially if you can go there during a Juneteenth festival. It is something to behold. In 1980, Emancipation Day in Texas became a legal holiday in recognition of Juneteenth. However, state offices do not close completely, as it is considered a partial staffing holiday. Elsewhere, the holiday is also referred to as Emancipation Day, Freedom Day, and Black Independence Day. The 13th Amendment abolishing slavery was ratified by the required 3/4 of the states in 1865, but Kentucky was not one of those states. In fact, let me ask you, do you all have any idea when Kentucky abolished slavery? I mean, it's wild.
1970 something, wasn't it?
Yes, you remember what I told you. She is a party pooper. Yes, it was 1976. It was still on the books until 1976. They still could have enslaved us. you know.
Wow.
That's right, Kentucky did not officially agree to outlaw slavery until 111 years after the 13th Amendment, prohibiting involuntary servitude became the law of the land. But if you feel bad about how long it took us to do it, here's a little fact you might be interested in hearing. Until February 7th, 2013, the state of Mississippi had never submitted the required documentation to ratify the 13th Amendment.
No, bad.
Meaning it never officially had abolished slavery.
5 years ago.
Until when?
Yeah, just 5 years ago. December 1865, after the necessary 3/4 of the 36 states voted in favor of ratification, Mississippi ratified the amendment in 1995. But because the state never officially notified the U.S. archivist, the ratification was not official. I'm sorry. It's not funny, but it just amazes me how some important things just get swept under the carpet. Let me give you a little information about General Granger. First, he was promoted to Major General of Volunteers in September 17, 1862, and took command of the Army in Kentucky. In 1869, Granger married Maria Letcher, daughter of a Lexington, Kentucky physician. In January 10, 1876, Granger died in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where he was serving in command of the District of New Mexico. However, ask me, where is he buried?
Where are you buried?
Lexington Cemetery. Probably because his wife's commitment to being here. There's some other things. I didn't want to go too long. You can ask any questions. What I'd like to see, first of all, I appreciate what Sarah and, what was her name? April, and I think Cheryl or somebody else is participating in this, and I really appreciate what you're doing, because this is the only way we're ever going to get a real holiday passed. A holiday that won't be like the Texas holiday. It's a holiday, but you better bring your butt to work, you know. Like I said down there, well, first of all, when I moved back here, and I told Yvonne Giles that we always had a Juneteenth festival in Austin. And she said, oh, what is it? And I told her what it was, and she said, well, why don't we have one? So I planned the first one that we had because we were connected with the African cemetery, in the African cemetery, because a lot of Africans are buried there. So it was fitting in one way. And what I did is, at that time, Teresa Isaacs was the mayor. She was kind enough to give me enough money that we could fly a friend of mine that I worked with at Houston Tolson College in Austin, who was a native Texan and knew all about Juneteenth. And so I asked her to come up here and be our keynote speaker. And like I said, the city paid for that. And then I got my friend who's the director at ARP in Lexington to donate food for breakfast. So we had a nice big breakfast, and but that was about, and a program. And that was about the most we could do at that time. Now, what I'd like to see us do is do it upright like they do down south. Have a band, at least one band, but they have a series of bands in different parks. Some gospel singing, or Negro spirituals, however you want to refer to it. I'd like to see the kids do creative things like write a poem, recite a poem, draw what they imagine a jubilee for Juneteenth would be like. Ask them, do they understand what slavery is? What it means to be enslaved by another human? And I say another human because, you know, they didn't think of us as humans, and we weren't counted as humans on the census. That's how they got away with a lot of the things they did. I think we were counted as 3/4 human, right? And that's why we couldn't vote, because we weren't a whole human. So I would like to see these things, and I'd like for more people to know what Juneteenth is all about. It's not just important to African Americans, it's important to the nation. Our history is your history too. Even though you don't find it in the history books and a lot of the literature books and some other things, but the reason I taught intergroup relations and cultural awareness at the Job Corps Center, oh goodness, I cannot begin to tell you how many different ethnicities and races we had there. And I was the only teacher that all of them had to go through. We had racial problems there. And I'm a strong believer, in order to get along, you have to get to know one another. You have to communicate. And I felt like when I started the International Day of the Child, that it would help if the kids and the teachers learn more about the different races that we had. We had so many, I had to put some of them under the same umbrella. Like we had Indians from the country India, we had Thais from Thailand, we had Cambodians, Vietnamese, we had Burmese, I had Chinese. I don't think I had any Japanese while I was there. So they were all under the category of Asians, with the exception of Indians. We had such a large group of Indians, we had them separately. We had so many Native Americans. I didn't even know there were that many nations. I promise you, I learned names, and it was so fascinating to me that the kids thought I was teaching them stuff. I was learning so much from them. You know, it was so fascinating to see. One, it started with a P, and I promise you it had 23 letters in the name. And I can't remember it, and the whole culture is so different from the rest of us here. The only behavioral problems I ever had were native-born Black Americans and white Americans and Mexican Americans. If they were Mexican national, if they came over here from Vietnam or old Mexico or wherever, they were well behaved. They respected authority and so forth. So I feel like as a nation, we have failed our young people in that respect. Because I had some girls that were there because they didn't like the looks of this homosexual boy. And they beat the crap out of him. Yes. And it's like, why? He wasn't bothering you. I had another one, and she was small. I think she's probably about my height, but the proper size. She was there because she hit the principal. Why did you hit the principal? He told me to shut up. I said, well, my mama doesn't tell me to shut up. I'm not gonna let him tell me to shut up. And I thought, wow. Whatever happened to civility? Whatever happened to respect? And I know you're thinking, we really don't have it now, and I agree with you. And we need to use more of it. I'm sorry. I got on the night clothes now. Let me think if there's anything else. I can't think of anything else that I need to add, but if you ask me a question, it might jar my memory or something. So feel free to ask me anything. Yes, hon?
Do you have any of this information like on a PowerPoint, like, or on the library page or somewhere where you can easily access this information?
Some of the information is on the internet, and there's some of it that I remembered from teaching this. I'll be more than happy to share it, but I'm not a tech savvy person, and I switched providers back to Spectrum, and I forgot that it hadn't been hooked up to Spectrum, so I couldn't print anything. And luckily, Sarah printed this, but I sent her the wrong information. So I can, she has a copy, or I'll send it to her and she can give it to you. Or if you give me your email address, I'll be glad to email it to you. Okay. And the pictures I thought twice about bringing, but some of them are so brutal, the hangings. And there were some that were brutally beaten to death, and I don't know if everybody can stomach that kind of stuff, you know. I don't want to whitewash the picture. I mean, these things happen, but I don't think that you and I have to see the pictures to believe it. Yes.
So how widely is Juneteenth celebrated throughout the U.S.? We talked about Texas and Kentucky, but how about other places?
Mostly the southern states, especially the ones that were kind of left out. Texas is really big on it. You know, Texas is big on everything. But the southern part of Oklahoma, maybe the whole state, but now, because this was a long time ago. Southwest Arkansas and western Louisiana. And I think Louisiana probably is about second to Texas with celebrating it.
Okay.
I think because the southern states knew about this before we did, you know. So it has grown, it's had plenty of years to grow. And because of the treatment there, which reminds me, let me give you a few more tidbits that I know you're dying to learn. Kentucky slaves, like me, where some of the white slave masters intentionally bred black female slaves to ship us down south to be house servants. And I just learned this a couple of weeks ago, that some of the mulattoes, as they call us, were shipped out to Vegas, another place, out west, I should say, not just Vegas, California, to be prostitutes. Because so many of the men liked our color that it was a big price for it, you know. And when I think about things like that, it makes me so angry. Because I remember when I first moved to Texas, and I have a lot of my father's blood in me, which means El Chico. I took a defensive driving class to get a 10% discount on my insurance. And it was so funny, in the first class I took, there was another guy named Dishman there, and we were both sitting on the front row. I was on the right, he was on the left. And the instructor, who had a strong British accent, I can't remember where he was from, the first thing came out of his mouth, "Oh, you too, Ken. He's white, I'm black." And I said, "Not that I know about, you know, but you never know." And he spelled his name the same way I did. The only other blacks I've ever known, if they weren't white, I met some in Houston, but they spelled their name differently from mine. But it doesn't really mean that much when you take into account slavery. We were separated so many times, and we had to assume our slave owners' names and so forth. That we're lucky if we can find who we are anywhere, you know. Yes, dear. Faith?
Yes. So slaves didn't have their own names, didn't keep their own names? I'm confused. You said that you have to take on the owner's last
Right.
name? Really?
Let's say that David Goins was my owner. I would be Marilyn Goins. But if he sold me to Claire, I can't remember the last name.
Carpenter.
If he sold me to Claire Carpenter, I would have to assume her name as Marilyn Carpenter, because she was my owner. We didn't have our own surnames.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I know.
I know on Facebook, a lot of people post things, like some people I went to college with in North Carolina, they have a big Juneteenth festival in
They
North
do?
Carolina. I see it on Facebook, and it's inviting people there, but I'm here in Kentucky, I'm not going all the way just for one day, just for a festival.
Well, you just stay longer. You never know what you might learn.
Well, I know, but
I know.
I don't travel.
I'll tell you something else interesting that I learned when I was in the Gambia in West Africa the first time. In 2003, they have an international roots festival like we do here in Lexington, except it's on an international. The first time I went, and even though I was there for a couple of weeks, it was before the festival. The second time I went to take my grandson, who kept bugging me, the festival had just occurred. I thought, dang, I have the worst, because I was looking online to see what it was and trying to plan our travels around that. But I understand it's a really big thing in the Gambia, because the Gambia is where Alex Haley's Roots was written. Thank goodness they've changed the name of the island. It was named after, he's not a king. Was he a king? It was James Island. I think it was named after a king or some white leader in Britain. They changed the name officially to Punta Kinte Island. It's been between the 9 years I was there. I guess sometime around 2008 or 2009, which was really neat. Of course, they have Alex Haley's picture up there on the cover of the magazine and talk about roots and stuff. And that is something else that I think every American should see, whether you're black or white, the conditions that we lived in. There's blood on the cave wall. All the men were always housed below ground, like in caves. And the women and children, La Filia, they had like a room about about 1/3 the size for all the women and babies if they had small babies. Then they had another third for youth. And then the last one was for women who had no children with them, or the children were too old or whatever, you know. And then all the men were in the ground. And they had a window on the outside, the courtyard where the captains and everybody stayed. It was about this tall. And as it went through the rocks, it got smaller and smaller. And that's how they slid in their trays of food for them. They were chained to the walls constantly. You can see, like I said, you can see blood on the walls where they bled from the chains, the shackles and stuff. And they were constantly together, defecating, urinating on each other, because they had no place to go. And without clothes. And even though that's a hot climate over there, it still can get cool at night, especially in the colder months. And you're talking about subterranean, 55 degrees. It's amazing. And you should see the quarters for the slave owners and the brokers and stuff. They had chairs and tables and stoves and everything you could have back in those days. And it was, there's a library over there that was run by some women. I don't think they were nuns, I can't remember exactly, but they have the real story they'll tell you about and everything. But it's heartbreaking. And I stood in the door of no return and show you my ignorance. I remember telling one of my friends over there, when I went to Jufuree, Goree Island, I think that's where, President Bush stood at the door and talked about he was in the door of no return. And I said that to my guide when I was in the Gambia. He said, every door is a door of no return. And I thought, he's right. The feeling you get when you're standing in that door, I'm not very good with measurements. I would say that the door is like the height of this library to the ocean floor. And they're huge boulders, just huge jagged boulders. Some people actually jumped to their deaths rather than getting on those ships because they knew they weren't, coming back. And all you can see is the Atlantic Ocean. I mean, you don't see land anywhere. And it's just really heartbreaking. And the other thing that amazed me, and this was in the Gambia, not in Senegal, where they actually have a jail for you while you're in the jail, so to speak, for the incorrigibles, as it said on the door. And even it was like a closet, a walk-in closet that you'd have in your bedroom. And they were piled in there too, if they didn't act right. It's really pathetic. It's enough to make you